Meadowood sew-along, and I think it's actually my favorite day. Okay, I know bias binding can feel overwhelming. In fact, if you read the written instructions, sometimes it's like, what in the world is she talking about? But I promise that if you just take it step by step, it's not nearly as confusing as you think it might be. So let's get started because I am very excited. I just love doing bias binding. I don't know why. I was scared for years to do bias binding, and then whatever method I came up with, or didn't, I should rephrase that. I didn't come up with the method, but the method that I sort of settled on, that made sense to my brain, that made sense to how I construct garments, once that like clicked, I was like, oh, it's not nearly as difficult as I thought. So I hope today's video really like clicks for you. By seeing it, by hearing me talk about it, I really hope that it makes sense to you and that now you won't be scared of bias binding either. Okay, so let's get started. You definitely need to have some pins or clips because we are going to be pinning that entire piece of bias around the neckline. Up the front, around the back, and then down the other side. So you're definitely going to want some pins. So grab those, grab your garment, and grab that really long, pretty piece of bias strips that we cut a couple of videos ago. And then let's get started. Okay, so depending on the amount of bias strip you have. I have way more than I need, but I prefer to work with more than I need than to get 3/4 of the way around and realize that I don't have enough and I have to like take the whole garment to the sewing machine and give myself some extra bias tape. So with that said, what I tend to do is take the bias tape and fold it in half. So find that center point. It doesn't have to be perfect because we already know, or I already know I have way too much bias tape. Okay, so this is roughly the center point. And the reason I say to do this is because we are going to work from the back neck down one side and then come back to the back neck and go down the other side. I like to fiddle with the bias tape down at the hem, which is going to be folded up anyways. So if you get a little bit off, you can do all of your adjusting down there, as opposed to realizing it part of the way through that something's off. Okay, so let me move my garment. We have, again, it doesn't have to be exact, but I'll put a pin in that center point. Okay. So, with your garment right sides up, locate approximately the center of that back neck, okay? Or none of this has to be perfect because we're just using this as a touch point. My favorite word, it's a touch point. If you get it right here, then working your way out from the back neck, everything should come together perfectly. Okay, so if I just like visually, this looks like about the center back. So with the bias tape, initially there may not have been a right or a wrong side, but once you sewed them together, there now is a right and a wrong side because the seam allowance is going to be on the wrong side. Okay, so take that pin and match up that pin with approximately where the center back is. Now, make sure that you have right sides together. The right side of the garment is facing up. The right side of the bias tape is facing down. So pin that in place. It doesn't have to be exact. Remember, we're just using this as a touch point. Now, you can go down the left or the right side. It does not matter. But what you are going to now do is slowly work your way, I gotta get these pins there. Work your way around the neckline, pinning. Now try not to stretch your bias tape. Remember, it's cut at a 45-degree angle so that it can really go around that neckline. But the only problem is that means it can also kind of grow. Now, most of the time, if it has gotten a little bit bigger, like after you've sewn it together, then you can honestly just take it to your ironing board, give it a couple really good steams, and most of the time that bias tape will go back into shape. And even sometimes just a good wash and dry in your washing machine. But for the most part, just try to match up the raw edges, but try not to stretch it. So we are going to just pin all the way around that neckline. So let me do this side, because then I will show you. I made way too much bias tape. But the good part is I actually have more strips, so what I can do is take what's left, sew those back together, and then end up with another usable chunk of bias tape. So it doesn't have to go to waste, and I would rather have too much bias tape when I'm going around than not enough. It does look like I'm gonna end on a seam, but that's not a big deal. Okay, so we did one side. Now you're gonna go back and you're basically just pinning the other side. The process is exactly the same. Again, just make sure that you are not stretching the bias tape. Pin as much as you need. Depends on my mood, depends on my fabric. You can pin a little, you can pin a lot. There's no right or wrong answer there. It's just what makes you feel comfortable when you get to the point where you will be at the sewing machine. Okay, and also if as you're sewing, so here everything seems, that I'm lining it up, I'm not stretching. But as you're sewing, you can make those adjustments. Similar to a knit neckband, we're going to be sewing in, smaller chunks, just like, I would say like an inch or two. So we'll sew for an inch or two, then stop, then make sure everything is where it needs to be, and then start sewing again. So if you realize that maybe you actually need to adjust the bias tape a little, you can definitely do that, because you're not just going full out and hoping that everything comes together correctly. Okay, so it's all pinned. Obviously I have a huge extra strip, so I'm not going to cut it right on the edge in case I have to make some adjustments. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of a tail, but I don't need all this extra bias tape getting in my way when I'm actually at the sewing machine. Okay, see, you can take these and sew them together and add any other strips that you still have and have another section of great bias tape. Okay, let's head to the machine. We're gonna sew this bias tape on with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now, we're gonna work slowly. So you're basically sewing for an inch or two, stopping, making sure that everything is good, and then continuing on. If you would like, just as we pinned, you can actually start sewing at the back neck and sew down one side, come back to the back neck and sew down the other side. That way you've got any excess bias tape will be down at the hem, as opposed to trying to deal with extra bias tape at the back neck. So anyways, however you choose to do it, I typically like to go center back down one side, center back down the other side. Okay, let's go sew it, and then we will talk about the next step. Okay, so starting roughly at center back, you will put it into the machine, and remember 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we are going to sew an inch or two, and then stop, make any adjustments, and then keep on stitching. So now that your bias strip is sewn onto the right side of your garment, we actually need to trim the seam allowance before we understitch. So if you're not familiar with understitching is when you sew the seam allowance to the bias binding. You'll see understitching in various places, but in this case, we will trim the seam allowance and then we're going to sew the seam allowance to the bias binding. But before we can do that, we need to trim that seam allowance as well as trim so that it is even with the bottom edge. Now, I would do it about 1/4 of an inch. That gives you a good amount of space for doing the understitching. So even though I always use my rotary cutter, you can use whatever you would like. Be extra careful around the neckline as you don't want to clip into the actual shirt or trim into the actual shirt. This edge does not need to be finished as you've done the other edges because it will be completely enclosed into the bias binding. So just give it a good trim all the way around. And then, just as we did with the other side, trim it to be flush with the bottom edge. Just as we did for all of the other pressing, you want to work from the wrong side of the garment. And you're going to be pressing that seam allowance towards the bias binding. So again, you kind of give it a second, move on to the next one, and then you will just be working your way around the entire garment. But actually, I just remembered, we need to clip the back neckline. Okay, so let me just clip the back neckline. I'll show you guys here. So if you can see, this bias tape wants to kind of, because the neckline is curved, it is laying funny. So the benefit of clipping that back neckline is that it will help the bias tape and the entire neckline really sit flat. Now you can do like notches. I'm kind of lazy for notches. I just do clips in so that it gives the fabric a way to move around that curve. So just make sure you clip that curve. And then let's pretend like I told you to do that before I told you to start pressing the seam allowance. Now just work your way around the garment, pressing the seam allowance towards the bias tape. Now, I know a lot of times, especially when I first started, I kind of would get lazy with pressing. And I learned over the years that your finished garment is going to be so much better if you take the time to press your garment in the various steps. So this this understitching is going to turn out so much better if you take the time to really press that seam allowance towards the bias tape. Okay, so we've almost made our way around. Again, remember, we are trying not to push too much on the fabric, but more setting it on top of the fabric, and give it a second. And then we are almost done. So once you have it really well pressed, we are going to take it to the sewing machine, and I prefer to, let me move this out of the way. You can sew that, you can do that understitching either from the wrong side so that you can watch that edge of your seam allowance and your stitch from the previous seam, or you can do it from the front side. Now, I'm sure if you looked at a book or talked to somebody who was classically trained in sewing, they're going to tell you there's a specific way to do it. And I'm going to tell you, you do what you need to do to sew this, to do this understitching. I tend to sew, I actually don't know what I do. I'll probably sew from the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from the top. So let's take it to the sewing machine and understitch this seam allowance to the bias binding. With the seam allowance understitched to the bias tape, here, let's have a look so you can see exactly what it looks like from the right side of the garment. So if you see here, you've got the original seam and then the understitching line. This is not going to be visible from the front of the garment. So if there are any spots, which I'm sure there are, that aren't perfect, it doesn't matter, because that is what it's going to look like from the front. If you are going to be putting interfacing in your garment, which if you remember, I said usually the lighter weight fabrics, it's helpful to have a bit of interfacing for the buttons and the buttonholes. If it's a heavier fabric such as this like cotton linen, you can probably get away with not doing it. But let me go ahead and show you what it looks like, where it goes, and all of that. Okay. So here is the front piece, and right here is the yoke seam. So we're focusing on from the yoke seam down to the bottom hem. So you've got your piece of interfacing that is the same length as your button guide. Now you will line it up with the sticky side down, so the little bumps, along the original stitching line. Okay, so once it's in place, you will take your, you can use pressing cloth. I'm kind of lazy, so if it's literally sitting right here, then I'll probably use it. If not, I just go for it. So you will give that a good press depending on what the instructions say for your interfacing. And then once it is pressed, you will just repeat the same for the other button band. Okay, so the rest of the steps for the bias binding, we use the iron a ton. So get a comfortable setup, whatever works for you. I like these tabletop ironing boards for smaller projects like this. Okay, what you will be doing is taking this outside edge of the bias binding. It will be folded in and you line it up with the under stitching line, okay? What I like to do is kind of work a couple inches at a time. So while it's pressing really well, you get the next section ready to go. You can give it a little steam. So if you can see that, I probably should have used a better color thread, but right there is the under stitching line. Okay, here is what I'm gonna tell you. It doesn't have to be perfect. As long as you don't go past the original stitching line, you're totally fine, okay? So just like turn on a show and do all your pressing, and I promise it will turn out fantastic. The other thing to remember when you are doing this is to try not to stretch the bias tape kind of out of whack. So don't pull it. Try to just fold it over as gently as you can. Now, if you don't want to just sort of fold it as you go, feel free to fold and pin, or if I can find it, I don't know where it is. Use that trusty glue stick, because you could put some glue on it, fold it over, and then when you press it, it really locks that glue in. So whatever you have to do to you know, feel like you could take it to the machine and sew it, you do that, okay? Yeah, try not to stretch the bias tape. That's the biggest. And then aim for the under stitching line, but if you go a little over, it's not a huge deal, as long as it stays within the original sewing line. You may get some pieces like this where once it's folded, you've got this corner from when we created the bias strip. You can just trim that off. Okay, we just have one more section. It may not look like it here, but I am actually lifting it up. So I'm just saving my wrist and trying not to lift it up too much. You can see here we've gotten to that interfacing. So what's happening is you are folding it and it will be enclosed in this fold. Just as you go, give it really good presses. Okay, so now you have done that. And believe it or not, it's one more press and then sewing. And that's it. You have done the bias binding. It's so easy, I told you. Okay, so you have folded it over, lined it up with that under stitching line. Now, you will take it and fold the entire bias binding inside the garment. Feel free to pin, use the glue, whatever you need to do. But if you see that understitching really helps sort of fold everything over. So from the front, it's gonna look like that. Okay, so you will be pressing again. And as you're folding, you will find that it really, it wants to fold in this direction. Based on all of the other stitches and folding, it just kind of naturally wants to press towards the inside of the garment. Now, when you are getting to that neckline, remember we trimmed the seam allowance, clipped into the seam allowance, so that along the back neck, it would lay really flat. And you're really gonna see that as we get to this back neck. So let me get there. Okay, So we are now at the back neck. Now, had we not clipped into the seam allowance, it would have a really hard time making this curve. But now that we have, you will just slowly, this one really has you working like a little bit at a time because of that angle. Okay, and then just slowly work your way around that back neck. And I promise, if you just move, you know, an inch at a time, then you get to make any adjustments you need to. And as long as you clipped that neckline, you are good to go. Okay, do you see that? Look how perfectly, that lays perfectly flat. Okay, that's the hardest part. So now you just finish going around. Again, I've done this a million times, as I would say to my kids. So clearly I can move at a different pace, but don't let how I do it slow you down or make you feel like you have to go any faster. Pause the video and work your way around the bias binding. Give it really good steams. Now, because we pressed it, it actually should just stay where it needs to be when you take it to the machine. But feel free to add clips or pins, whatever you need to do to go sew it down. So let me take you over to the machine and I will show you how to sew it down, because I'm probably going to do it the wrong way. You know how I said for the under stitching, I wasn't sure whether I sew from the front or the back. Well, I am positive that I actually sew the bias binding from the back, and that's probably really naughty, but I do it anyways. And the reason I do that is it's not perfect. Like, as much as I would like to say, oh, it's so perfect and I never make any mistakes, sometimes it is not as wide throughout as it should be. So that usually is because at the very beginning when I sewed it on, I didn't get those raw edges together. So here's a perfect example. If you look here, here and here, you can see that around the neckline, hopefully you can see that, around the neckline is actually just ever so slightly more narrow than this part. That doesn't surprise me at all. So if I was to sew from the front and say, okay, I'm gonna sew at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and I'm just gonna sew from the front and hope I catch the back, I probably would for the most part, but you may actually miss some spots. So what I like to do is actually sew from the wrong side. And I know it's probably not correct, so you can do it a different way. But if I sew from the wrong side, then I can watch that edge. And if it looks like if I keep that same seam allowance, that I'm going to miss it, then I kind of decrease the seam allowance a little, catch that edge, and then slowly work my way to the correct seam allowance. Here's the thing. No one is gonna know. The difference is, you know, maybe 1/8 of an inch. So it makes a big difference when you're wearing the garment, because if you miss, say, the whole back neckline in catching it for sewing that bias down, you're gonna have it not lay flat against your body. So even though it's not proper, that's how I do it. Then I ensure that I have grabbed the edge of the bias binding the entire way around. So believe it or not, we have one step left, and then you have attached the bias binding. to the final step, which is buttonholes and buttons. We need to hem the top. We will be hemming the bottom and the sleeves with the same seam allowance, and that is, we're going to be doing a 1/4 inch fold and then another 3/4 inch fold for a total of a 1 inch removed for the hem. Now, if you're working with a shifty fabric, or if you're not wanting to just go and measure as you do the hem, I have a way that I always do my hem. So let me show you. So I took my shirt to my sewing machine and I sewed a basting stitch 1 inch from the bottom hem around the entire bottom of the shirt. Now the reason I do that is so that I have some sort of guide when I'm at my ironing board to use while pressing the bottom hem in place. I don't generally do it for the 1/4 inch. I tend to just eyeball that, but I find that to get a much cleaner and more consistent hem, that if I do this basting stitch first, then it makes pressing for the hem so much easier. So now that I have gone around and done a 1 inch basting stitch, I'm gonna go ahead and grab my ironing board and my iron, and we're gonna press the 1/4 inch fold and then the 3/4 inch fold. And you can see how I sort of do that on the go. Before we actually start pressing, I do want to show you, you may find that you get spots where maybe your bias tape extended past the bottom of the hem, or in this case, it looks like while I was sewing the bias tape, I actually also kind of got off a little bit. So the easiest way is to take that rotary cutter and just trim it so that it's even. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it will make your hemming so much easier. Okay, so we're gonna do the 1/4 inch press first. And like I said, I like to eyeball this. So I kind of do what looks like about a 1/4 inch. And you're gonna fold and press as you go. And you'll just do this around the entire top. It does not have to be perfect. Try to lift between pressing as opposed to dragging the iron across your fabric. That will keep it from stretching out, especially if you're using a shifty fabric like this. If you're using something that's more stable, like a linen or a cotton, it's not going to want to stretch out like a shifty rayon will. Okay, so you will just keep going around. Other side, as long as you haven't shifted your fabric, it should match up perfectly. But again, shifty fabric can kind of have its own mind sometimes. Give it a really good press. And so now you can see we have our 1/4 inch seam allowance pressed. So we're gonna go back to the beginning, and now using that basting stitch as a guide, you will press all around the outside with that basting stitch, just either right at the fold, or sometimes I even just bring it slightly towards the back. So just make sure that that initial 1/4 inch fold is still in place when you are pressing out the rest of the hem. Once you have sewn that hem into place, you can then remove that basting stitch that we put into it. So we've got it all pressed, and now we will take it to the sewing machine, sew that hem down, and repeat the same process, the exact same process for the sleeve. Are done the same way as the bottom hem. So what you will do is, let's find a sleeve. You will sew that guideline again. Remember, the guideline is 1 inch from the hem. So in this case, the hem of the sleeve. And you will go around and press the 1/4 inch. We'll do it real quick because the sleeve is pretty quick. And then once you have done the 1/4 inch, you will go back and do the 3/4 of an inch. Now again, remember I did mention that I just eyeball this 1/4 of an inch. If you wanted to, you can measure it with like a little ruler, a seam gauge, or repeat this same 1 inch guideline, but do it at a 1/4 of an inch. And okay, so let's quickly do the 1 inch. Remember, we're pressing, trying not to drag the iron across the fabric. And take as much time as you need to get this, really well pressed, because your finished garment is going to look so much better if you take the time to do pressing. I think we've all probably done a garment where we didn't think the pressing was that important, but then it was actually quite noticeable if you didn't press before you sewed. Okay, so here it's all done. The sleeve has been folded and pressed. Now I want to show you how I actually sew when it comes to a sleeve, because this is, quite a small circumference. So what I like to do is I turn the garment wrong sides out so that you can see, sorry, it's all twisted, so that you can see that hem that you pressed. So with the shirt wrong sides out, we will then take it to the sewing machine, and you can, if you would like, if you've got a sewing machine that has the ability to remove part of the base so that there's a sleeve, you could put it in there. But the benefit to doing it like this is that you can load it into your machine so that the rest of the sleeve fabric is on the top so you can see it. Because if you were to try to sew it like this, then there's a chance you can catch the stuff in the back. So I like to turn the sleeve right side or wrong sides out, and then put it into the sewing machine like this. And so that allows me to sew on the right side of the garment while also having the rest of the sleeve on the top so that it doesn't accidentally get folded into the seam because I've missed it. So I will show you on the sewing machine exactly what I mean when I do this. Now that you have your sleeve and bottom hem all done and we've got the bias binding all installed, you are done for today. Tomorrow we will be talking all about buttons and buttonholes. I promise it's not as difficult as it can seem, but I also have a few things you can try if you don't want to do buttonholes on your Meadowood. So make sure to come back tomorrow for the final video in the sew along. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified when the video is live. I look forward to sharing day 6 with you tomorrow.